Everyone has seen the photos. The sequins catching the light, the fedora tilted just enough to hide half his face, the sunglasses that never seem to come off, even indoors. But almost nobody stops to ask why any of it looked exactly the way it did. Not the surface level answer, the one you'd guess in 2 seconds, but the real reason, the one buried in interviews, old tour riders, and stories from the handful of people who actually built his wardrobe from scratch, season after season, tour after tour. Tonight, we're going through 8 more truths hidden inside the most analyzed closet in music history. And just like before, almost every single one of them starts as a practical problem before it ever becomes a style statement. What makes these particular secrets so fascinating is how quiet they were kept for so long. Most of this information never came from Michael himself, since he rarely explained the reasoning behind his own image in public interviews. Instead, it trickled out slowly, through wardrobe assistants who spoke decades later, through auction house records describing costumes in forensic detail, and through the archivists who were eventually trusted to handle his original pieces after his passing. Put those fragments together, and a much clearer picture emerges of a man who treated his closet less like a fashion collection and more like a workshop. Let's start with the fedora, because this is a piece almost every fan has copied at some point without ever understanding why he actually wore it. Casual viewers assume it was purely aesthetic, a classic accessory borrowed from old Hollywood glamour, something sharp to complete a silhouette. That's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The real reason runs deeper. Michael was intensely private about his face, especially in later years, and a fedora tilted at a steep forward angle does something very specific under stage lighting. It creates shadow across the upper half of the face while leaving the mouth, the jaw, and the dramatic lighting on his cheekbones fully visible to the audience. It let him control exactly how much of himself the crowd could see at any given moment. He wasn't hiding from the audience. He was choosing second by second how much of himself to reveal. That single detail, a hat brim tilted at a specific angle, turned a fashion accessory into a tool for managing exposure, distance, and mystery all at once. Now let's talk about something almost every fan has seen 1,000 times without noticing the engineering behind it, the buckles and straps that covered his jackets during the bad era. At first glance, they look purely decorative, a punk-inspired detail meant to look tough and rebellious on stage. But according to people who worked on those costumes, the straps weren't just visual, they were structural. Michael's choreography during that period involved sudden, explosive movement, drops to the floor, sharp spins, aggressive full-body gestures that put enormous strain on ordinary jacket seams. The buckled straps distributed that stress differently than a typical seam would, reinforcing the garment at exact stress points identified through actual rehearsal footage. Costume designers would literally study slow-motion tape of his movement, mark where the fabric pulled hardest, and place hardware directly over those points. What looked like an aggressive style choice was actually load-bearing design, hidden in plain sight as a fashion statement. That same philosophy, disguising function as flair, shows up again with something even smaller. The way his sunglasses became almost a second skin during the 1990s and 2000s. Fans built entire theories around it, some assuming it was about protecting his eyes from constant camera flashes, others assuming it was pure mystique. Both had a piece of the truth, but there's a detail most people miss entirely. Michael suffered from chronic dry eyes and a heightened sensitivity to bright light, a side effect connected to years of intense stage lighting and later, certain medical treatments. Dark, oversized lenses weren't just an image. They were a genuine physical necessity that also happened to double as one of the most recognizable parts of his offstage identity. He needed the glasses to function comfortably in bright environments. And once the world decided that look meant something mysterious and untouchable, he simply let that impression stand rather than correct it. Let's move to something that surprised even seasoned costume historians once they got close enough to examine it: the actual weight of his most famous jackets. Audiences watching from the seats or through a television screen have no real sense of how heavy these pieces truly were. The crystal-covered coats from his solo tours, the heavily beaded military jackets, some of these garments weighed well over 10 pounds. Once every embellishment was factored in, that created an entirely separate problem nobody in the audience ever considered. A 10-pound jacket doesn't just sit differently on the body, it changes balance, it changes how quickly a performer can spin, and it changes how much energy gets burned simply holding proper posture through a 2-hour show. His costume team had to build in hidden internal harnesses, essentially invisible support structures sewn into the lining, that redistributed the jacket's weight across the shoulders and back instead of letting it hang and drag on his frame. Nobody in the crowd ever saw those harnesses. They only saw a performer moving as if the jacket weighed nothing at all, which was, by design, the entire point. Now here's a detail that reveals just how far ahead of his time Michael actually was when it came to thinking about quick changes. During his most elaborate tours, certain costume transitions had to happen in under 30 seconds, sometimes less, while he was still moving, still mid-performance, hidden only by a brief blackout or a wall of dancers. A normal jacket with normal buttons simply cannot be removed that fast without looking sloppy on camera. The solution was a system of hidden magnetic closures and breakaway seams built directly into certain costume pieces. Closures disguised to look like ordinary buttons or zippers from a distance, but designed to separate instantly under a firm pull. Wardrobe assistants positioned in the wings were trained to strip an entire jacket off him in a handful of seconds, using nothing but practiced hand movements and these concealed release points. It turned what should have been a clumsy backstage scramble into something that looked, from the audience's perspective, like the costume simply dissolved and reappeared. That obsession with speed and precision extended into something even more mundane, the loafers he wore for his sharpest, most controlled footwork sequences. Fans always assumed these were simply stylish dress shoes chosen to match his sharp, formal stage aesthetic. The real reason has almost nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with sound. Certain routines depended on the audience being able to hear his footwork clearly, the taps, the slides, the sudden stops, layered as a kind of secondary percussion underneath the music itself. Ordinary rubber-soled shoes absorbed too much of that sound. So his team had small metal plates fitted into the heels, and in some cases, the toes of specific pairs, essentially turning his shoes into a functioning instrument. When he executed rapid footwork, those plates clicked against the stage floor with enough clarity that sound engineers could actually mix that clicking directly into the live audio, blending choreography and music into a single inseparable rhythm. Here's a secret that only became public knowledge decades later, once costume archivists were finally allowed to examine his private collection in detail. Michael kept meticulous backups of nearly every major stage outfit he ever wore. Not one spare, not two, but sometimes a dozen or more nearly identical versions of a single jacket or shirt. To an outsider, that might sound like simple excess, the habit of a wealthy performer who could afford anything he wanted in unlimited quantity. The real explanation is far more practical. Touring is brutal on fabric. Crystals fall off during aggressive movement. Seams fray under repeated stress. Sweat slowly degrades delicate material, night after night. Rather than risk a visible flaw appearing mid-tour on his single most important costume, his team built entire fleets of backups, constructed identically down to the placement of every bead, so that a damaged piece could be swapped out between cities without any visible difference to the audience. It wasn't vanity, it was insurance against the sheer physical toll of performing at that level night after night, year after year. Before we get to the final truth, there's one more detail worth slowing down on, something almost nobody associates with costume design at all: temperature. Stage lights generate an enormous amount of heat, and layered under hot lighting rigs for 2 straight hours, heavy embellished fabric can turn into a genuine health risk rather than a simple discomfort. Overheating on stage isn't just unpleasant, it can cause dizziness, dehydration, and in extreme cases, it can force a performer to cut a show short entirely. To manage this, certain jackets were quietly lined with lightweight, breathable mesh panels hidden beneath the crystal work, placed specifically along the back and underarms where heat builds up fastest. From the audience, the jacket looked identical to any other heavily beaded stage coat. Underneath, it was functioning almost like a piece of athletic gear, engineered to let heat escape without letting a single visible gap appear in the design. It's the kind of detail that never shows up in a photograph, but without it, some of his most demanding routines would have been physically impossible to finish night after night. There's also the matter of color testing, something few fans realize was ever a concern at all. Certain fabrics that look perfectly sharp under normal room lighting behave completely differently once they're hit with intense colored stage lighting, particularly the deep reds and blues used heavily during ballad performances. A black jacket, for instance, can appear slightly green or muddy under certain gel lighting if the fabric isn't chosen carefully, an effect that's invisible in a fitting room, but painfully obvious to thousands of people watching live. Because of this, his costume team would run test fittings under actual stage lighting rigs before finalizing any major new piece, sometimes rejecting fabric that looked flawless in daylight simply because it shifted color under the specific lighting a show required. It's an invisible layer of quality control that most fashion design ever has to consider, since almost no other industry demands that clothing perform correctly under both natural light and an ever-changing wash of colored stage beams at the same time. And that brings us to a final truth that ties every one of these secrets together into a single idea. Michael Jackson never treated costume as something separate from performance. Every hidden harness, every disguised magnet, every carefully studied stress point on a piece of fabric existed for one single purpose: to let him move exactly the way his imagination demanded without a single visible limitation standing in the way. Audiences saw a fedora, a jacket, a pair of shoes. What they were actually looking at was a small engineering project disguised as fashion, built by teams of specialists who understood that the difference between an ordinary performer and Michael Jackson often came down to details nobody in the crowd was ever meant to notice at all. That's 8 more secrets, 8 more pieces of thread, metal, and hidden design sitting quietly behind one of the most studied wardrobes in the history of popular music, proving once again that with Michael, nothing was ever just clothing. Every single piece was part of the performance itself.